Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Anthropology 415, 515 Ethnographic Methods. It's the 9th of September. It is Monday of week 4. We're going to be doing research design, experiments, and experimental thinking, along with research ethics this week. A lot to cover, a lot of concepts and terms. This is also kind of the end of Unit 1, I guess you could say, of this class in which we're kind of preparing you for your research, kind of thinking about what kind of stuff you might be looking at. And then beyond, after this, we'll start talking about actual research methods, kind of one a week for most of the rest of the semester for our big Unit 2. Okay, this week you have discussion board number 4, homework number 3, and quiz number 2. Let's take a look. I'll start with the quiz so you know what you're kind of looking for this week. Quiz number 2. This chapter is called Research Design. What does Bernard mean by research design? That's good. You should know what your author means by the title of their chapters. You're going to also compare and contrast true experiments with natural experiments, and naturalistic experiments. What are the strengths and weaknesses for each? We are also going to talk about cultural relativism and moral relativism, 3 compounds that might threaten the validity of your research. So we'll talk about those through the course of this week. You also have a discussion board. We'll be talking about ethics later on. Give an example of ethical dilemmas you might face studying a topic as an ethnographer and how you might respond. Some people have already posted that. Make sure you respond to somebody else. Don't just post yours. Now there's already 4 people posted. So if you have already posted, or if you're new to posting, don't forget to keep responding to someone else. And then this week we'll be doing human subjects review. We'll talk about this probably on Friday. But we'll also be this is the part I wanted to focus on for this part of the class, is we'll be kind of nailing down your research question and your variables that you're going to study. And we kind of played around with this a lot 2 weeks ago. And then you did a literature review last week. How did that go? Did you find some good stuff? Yeah? Those of you who are on the fence, were you able to get some help? Did you find, what did you decide to do, Alexis?
Oh, I kind of did find the like groundwork for
Good.
research. So now I'm just still doing homework too. So.
Yeah, good. So if you were having some questions about what your topic should be, now's the time to kind of put those to rest. The same with if you're kind of on the edge about what variables and how you might operationalize this, right? So we're going to take a look at that this week as well. So if you're still kind of figuring out what you want to study, please come talk to me and I'll help point you in the right direction. Okay, so that's kind of the big things we're doing this week. Jose has helped me with another PowerPoint. Let's take a look at this. So we're going to go through this. My idea is to kind of go through today, talk about what are experiments. We'll also kind of talk about confounds, and we'll see if we can figure out what some of those confounds are to our good experiments. And then hopefully we'll get the doc cam all fired up and we can talk about different types of experiments you might want to run. Okay. We often in anthropology, especially in cultural anthropology, don't normally think of, in kind of the undergrad version of this discipline, we often don't think of experiments, right? We think of experiments as being something that you do in psychology or something that you do in the natural sciences or in chemistry or something like that. But Bernard, and I kind of agree with him, says that, anthropology is most powerful, especially cultural, when we're not just doing descriptions, right? What people have called intellectual butterfly collecting, but instead actually like testing things, right? There are quite a few issues involved with looking at people, doing experiments on people that you might not have if I was experimenting with rocks or with fish or with trees or things like that, and we will talk about those as well. So, but his argument, I guess, in this chapter is that experimental design is important for cultural anthropology, and that when you have a good research design, it really helps you make a good project. And conversely, probably even more importantly, no amount of good field work is going to save a bad research design, right? You're not going to get a better research design by putting more effort into something that's already kind of broke from the get-go. So it's good to think about what you're going to do before you do it, especially as you kind of go further in anthropology, right? For this class, if you have a kind of a mediocre or mid-tier research design and it doesn't really work out, your research is kind of wishy-washy, it doesn't really say anything powerful, you'll probably still get a good grade in this class, right? I'm just happy that you tried. But if we're talking about going to spend multiple years of your life living in another country, away from friends and family, spending tens of thousands of dollars of either your own money or the government or some funding agency's money, it's probably good to have your research design pretty well figured out before time and treasure is expended and not the best way. So this is probably, I don't want to say it's the hardest chapter in Bernard because some of those statistical chapters are just kind of like a little bit above my head. But I think it is one of the more challenging to think about just because we often, just like any kind of exercise, if you don't work those muscles, they aren't very well developed. So we often, I think, especially at the undergraduate level, have you ever done any kind of experimental design, either in anthropology or in any other class, science or something like that? Do we have an idea of what I'm talking about? What's an example of something maybe you have either done yourself or have run into, in your.
So say like with electrophorus, you have to prepare everything beforehand before you can actually set any concepts and run it. You have to prepare the gel, prepare the compound.
And then when you
write about it.
And then when you run it, what are you comparing?
You're comparing the molecules through the gel to see which one went to the other end, and it's kind of like a barcode. Then you write it up.
Yeah, and you're comparing at least two groups, right? One who's apparently getting some kind of treatment and one who's not, maybe, right? You're doing an experiment. You're comparing and contrasting is pretty much what we're talking about, right? And that could be for lots of different things. It could be on the cellular level or the subatomic level, right? I'm working at CERN. I'm a high-paid nuclear physicist or something, and I'm going to test, I don't know, quarks or electrons or something, right? And I'm going to do one thing to one group and one thing to another. I'm going to run some different constraints on one type of experiment than the other, and I can see something, right? Same way, if you're in biology, I'm going to look at the difference between these two fish populations, right? One that is in a protected area and one that's people fish in the pond, right? And what are the different outcomes of this, right? And we can do that for people as well. Experimental methods are really important, right? It gives a sense of evidence. This is on page 109. A sense of evidence, a realization of the difficulties of human observation, the kinds of scientific consensus which no other field of study can impart so well. And a lot of when we talk about experiments, right? We in anthropology, especially in cultural, don't often run what he'll call true experiments, lab experiments. But it is important for us to kind of think about what those are, and then we can kind of expand on that, or we can use it as an analogy, or we can modify them slightly to just talk about how we might do that in an ethnographic context, right? Okay. So the first thing he talks about is you can look over here, slide number 1. He talks about different kinds of experiments. In the first one, right, we can kind of differentiate between on one axis true experiments versus what he calls quasi experiments. And this variability this dichotomy is really about assignment of participants, right? In a true experiment, you want to assign people randomly, or fish or rocks or whatever you're going to do, right? And this way that there's no prior confounds on your outcomes, right? So if I want to study, we often get this in medical trials, right? If we have this new wonder drug that this company has made and we want to test it, right? So commonly they do, what's called double-blind true experiments, where people are assigned to different categories. Half of the class you get miracle drug, half the class no drug, right? Why do we do that? Why is science often set up that way, where half of your participants in a true experiment are going to get the treatment and the other half are not? What does that accomplish? Yeah, right. Or we can see if there's a placebo effect, or if these things are actually going on, right? So If we give the treatment to everybody, we don't know what the actual effect is. We don't know if it's just time or if there's a significant difference, right? So random assignment of people or categories or objects or whatever we're going to study into these categories is what makes it a true experiment. However, we in anthropology often don't do true experiments. We do what's known as quasi experiments. And this is rather than assigning people to a group, selecting, creating these two groups, our control group and our treatment group, but we select those participants instead of randomly assigning it. Why do you think that is? So for example, I have a random experiment I want to conduct. When I'm working at cacao growers, we had this idea that if we come through with, we hire people with chainsaws and they come through and they chainsaw the limbs off of your cacao tree. It'll get rid of all this disease and it will actually make the tree produce more because cacao like freaks out when it gets cut and produces a lot more fruit. What might be the problem if I go through one village and I just say, okay, households on the right side of the street, you're getting the experiment. We're going to cut your trees for free. We're going to do all this stuff for you. People on the left side of the street, you're my control group. We're not going to actually do this for you. Well, I mean, that's a good experimental design and it's true experiment, but why might that be a problem?
People might get mad at you.
Yeah, or at each other, right? Like, why are they getting something good and I'm not? This is more pronounced, you'd be like, well, it's just like it's agriculture, like people win and lose. But like, especially in like medical research, right? It's often, we'll talk about ethics. It can be pretty unethical to be like, I have this life-saving drug, you're all dying. This could save your life, but experimental validity is very important. So you have to, half of the population are going to suffer this harm because I want to like keep my experiment going, right? There's lots of reasons why logically, in an ideal world, true experiments are great. But oftentimes there's lots of problems which, people actually need our help in like an applied anthropology kind of way, in which it's not ethical for us to withhold that kind of selection or treatments. The other thing is that oftentimes there are these kind of natural groupings, and it's super difficult, if not impossible just impossible, we can say, to assign people to grouping. So for instance, I want to study the effects of political affiliation on belief in the Loch Ness Monster. That's a good research question, right? Do I think, and I can hypothesize Republicans or Democrats are going to be more likely, whoever, right? What's the problem with randomly assigning people to those two groups?
They may not be what you assigning them to.
Yeah, like, you're a Republican, you're a Democrat. They'd be like, no, I'm not. Like, you don't get a pick for me, right? Same with it in my research. I had, I'll show you my original PhD research design. I still have it like on a napkin somewhere. My professor drew it for me. Light bulb moment. But we were looking at land tenure and what Catholics versus Protestant cacao farmers in this community thought about private land tenure versus communal land tenure, right? The problem was I couldn't fix either variable, right? I couldn't randomly assign people to be Protestant or Catholic. That's kind of unethical. Like now you got to go to this church and now you got to go to this church, right? Just because I randomly pulled your name out of a hat. And I couldn't make people change their land tenure holdings. They'd be like, oh, you got communal land. Now I guess you got to go buy some leased land just because that's how my experiment's going to work, right? So instead, we're going to select people who meet those categories, right? So instead of assigning people randomly, what I did was I'm going to take 10 Catholics who have private land, 10 Catholics who have communal land, 10 Protestants with communal land, 10 Protestants with private land, and then I'm going to compare, right? So rather than me assigning people randomly to groups, we can use what's already out there in nature or in society as our quasi experiments. The other thing we can do, that's one axis, right, of dichotomy. And there's some variability like in the middle between true experiments over here and quasi experiments over here. Another axis we can talk about is the difference between laboratory experiments and field experiments, right? And when we talk about anthropology, which do you think we're going to be doing more of? Yeah, field experiments, right? It's why Part of the rite of passage of doing your kind of PhD or master's in cultural anthropology is going in the field, right? We can do a lot of things in the lab. In some fields in anthropology, just especially linguistics, is much more interested in like lab experiments. So if you're interested in like, I want to look at how different words are pronounced by different socioeconomic classes. I can have, go have my linguistics lab and I invite, participants in. And now here, tell me how much money you earned last year, what college you went to, or whatever as my indicator. And then hey, we read this passage, right? And my hypothesis is that people who went to, good schools and are rich are more likely to read something like Shakespeare more easily than someone who didn't graduate high school or something like that, right? We can do those kind of experiments. But often what we're doing is field experiments. And this is often in linguistics too, right? Bowe's famous sociolinguistics experiments in which he looked at dialect and class. He did that in New York City department stores, right? So instead of inviting people into the lab, he actually went to department stores and asked me, where are the coat department? And he wanted to see how people said the fourth floor. That was like his thing. So was it the fourth floor or the fourth floor, right? Like there was this kind of New York accent he was looking at that he assigned with class, right? And so you got a lot more out of this kind of natural environment than you did in the lab. Why? Why do you think Labov did that? It's a famous study from the 60s. And so rather than calling people into the lab, he actually went out to calling people in the lab to look at how people pronounce things differently depending on their socioeconomic class. He went out in the field and studied them in New York City department stores. Costs more money, it takes more time, it's probably a little more difficult because you got to ride the subway, but like why bother doing that? What's the benefit?
Variety of people that you interact with.
All right, maybe you don't get the kind of people who sign up for lab studies at a university are already a certain kind of people, right? They're probably already of a certain class because they're hanging out at university to those students or they work there somehow, so they see your flyers or something like that, right? You get more naturalistic and you may get it more like more real, right? Have you ever been in like a testing situation and felt like you had to give the right answers or like that you kind of freeze up or you're performing a certain way because you're in this lab setting, right? It's a white room and they got like monitors and they got like science equipment everywhere. So maybe you're going to act differently in a certain kind of way because you're expected to act a certain way than if you're just doing your minimum wage job at a department store in New York. You're less likely to have those kind of trying to act a certain way kind of behaviors. They're all experiments, no matter which of these we do, but it is good to kind of think about it. So we will be doing most likely, you'll be doing a quasi-experiment in which your subjects are assigned or are selected rather than assigned because, whether you're picking rural versus urban people, whether you're picking Republicans versus Democrats, whether you're picking men versus women, it's already out there. We'll be selecting from it, and we'll probably be doing mostly field experiments because, we don't have a lab where you can bring people in and test their beliefs in ghosts or something like that. Okay. So when we do, this is like basic scientific method-y kind of stuff. When we do experiments, there are 5 basic steps in like the classic experiment. And we're going to actually probably, looks like we'll go through this maybe Wednesday. We might start on it today. We'll talk about a variety of research designs, and some of them modify this in different ways, right? But it's good to have an understanding of what the basic is, right? This is the basic experiment. Like I was just run a normal experiment. This is what it would be. But for different reasons at different times and because of different constraints, we might change a few of these things, right? But in general, when you do an experiment, whether it's in anthropology or whether it's in biology or nuclear physics or something like that, the first thing you got to do is form a hypothesis, right? And this is often based on previous research. There's like a step 0 here, which is not actually listed. Oftentimes before, if you're a master's student and I want you to go and you're putting together a prospectus, right? What do you need to do before you formulate a hypothesis?
Come up with a question.
Yeah, right. You actually have to have a topic or a question or something, and you probably are going to do some background, either reading or research, right? So what did we do last week in here? Not a trick. It was your homework last week.
Creating an data bibliography.
Yeah, right. And that's some background research. How would doing an annotated bibliography help you to formulate a hypothesis?
It can help you find research on what you're doing, yet also give you more avenues to explore.
Yeah, spoken like a librarian. Good job. Gives, yeah, I know. But yeah, it gives you more research to explore. Right? You can see what kind of stuff has already been done, so you don't do the same thing over. Right? You can be like, I have a great idea for an experiment, and then you read, oh, somebody already did that, right? You can build off of what's already been done. And maybe it can tell you about some of the pitfalls, right? Somebody might be like, I had some problems, finding ghost hunters or something like that for my experiment, or asking people about the Loch Ness monster wasn't particularly useful in this one place because they called it something else, or right. It gives you kind of some background. You can also do what's called a pilot study. So before I started doing my PhD research, and before I lived for a year, and well, it was 2 years actually by that time, in southern Belize, and did all this work, right? I did all the reading beforehand, read all the books that I could find on Southern, but I actually went there too, right? And I asked people, what's the big deal going on, right? What's new in the community? What are people talking about, right? And that helps you know kind of what kind of topics are interesting to people there. Again, so that way when you start actually doing your research, people aren't just like bored, like, no, that was a project that happened like 10 years ago. We're not into that anymore. So step 0, do your background research, do your pilot study, figure out if it's going to be viable. And oftentimes, like I said, this can be done through your previous research or someone else's. Then based on that, you're going to formulate a hypothesis, right? You're going to have a research question first, like Alicia said. So if my research question is, do people in Scotland believe in Loch Ness Monster more than people in Eastern New Mexico, right? That is a research question. And then step 1, form a hypothesis, right? I hypothesize that. What's a hypothesis I could have for that research question? I think that people in Scotland are going to have more belief in Loch Ness Monster, and you want to say why, right? It's not just enough to be like, I think the red frogs will jump higher than the green frogs. You have to tell us why. Then you're going to, in a true experiment, you're going to randomly assign participants. So half of your group is going to be in the control group where they don't get the treatment, and half the group is going to be in the intervention group. Then you're going to measure the dependent variable in one or both of the groups. We'll talk about the different experiments with that. This is what's often called like a pre-test, where you test something beforehand, right? So there's a famous experiment that he talks about in here about shooting free throws, right? This is like sports med science stuff, right? So in basketball, you're going to learn to shoot a free throw, right? I divide you into 2 groups, and my experiment is that I have this new way. I hypothesize that the granny shot, you shoot like this, is actually much more efficient than the way they shoot in the NBA. This has actually been scientifically proven. I'm not sure who got funding for this. And so I'm going to experiment. I'm going to divide up my participants. All of you are in my basketball study. Half the room, you're going to get the new secret technique, the granny shot, and the other half are going to shoot free throws normally. Why might it be important for me to pre-test both of my groups to understand if the granny shot actually helps?
See if they can even make a free throw.
Yeah, right. And I want to have a baseline to compare against, right? So I'm going to test both groups beforehand, because just because I randomly assign people to a group doesn't mean that they're going to be equal, right? Because I happen to randomly assign people, but all the basketball players ended up in the control group, and all the people who never played basketball are going to enter into my experimental group. So even if the granny shot is much more effective, those people already have a lot more skills at playing basketball, so it'll probably mess up my experiment. So what I can do instead is I can do what's called a pre-test, where I've assigned people to the random groups, and then I'm going to test them, right? So I'll say, here you go, your group A, your group B. Everyone now takes 10 free throws, right? And I can average, so for instance, group A, the control group, they average 7 out of 10 free throws, and group B, my control group, or my experimental group, they averaged 6 out of 10 free throws, right? So then instead of just kind of saying, well, having just one number at the end, I can actually compare and contrast, right? I can say, I can give the experimental group the lesson. Here's how you shoot the granny shot. It's much more efficient, like tell them all the ways to do it. And then I take a second test, right? And number 5, this is your post test. And then I can compare, right? So group 1 didn't, the control group, they shot 70% before, they got no treatment, they got no new lessons. So probably they're going to shoot 70% again, more or less, because we didn't change any variables. There are other things that could happen. We'll talk about some of those compounds in a second. But all things being equal, right, they didn't learn anything, and so it should be pretty much the same. But I could say that group 2 went from 6 to 7, right? That's a pretty big improve. It's not, it's still the same level as the control group, but we saw more increase, and we wouldn't get that without having the pre-test. We wouldn't know that there was an increase from 1 to 2. Yeah. So that is kind of the basics. If I'm like, design a perfect true experiment, right? That's going to be how you do it. And he gives a lot of good examples in here. He's really into research design. I never had Bernard as my professor, but one of his students, Clarence Gravely, he writes about a bunch in this book, was my professor. So he's like my grand professor, I guess. So heard a lot of these stories, right? This is an experiment. Take 100 college women age 18 to 22, randomly assign them to 2 groups, 50 each, bring them into a lab, show them 3-digit numbers, right? Then you pre-test, you say group 1 has an 85% efficiency at, remembering a pre-test, and group 2 at an 84, whatever. I get my baseline. Then I give half of the group listening to classical music while I do this card experiment to see how many does classical music change. And the other group gets no music, right? Because they got no music the first time, or we do rock music or whatever, right? We changed one thing for half of the people, and then we see, people who listen to classical music scored higher the second time, right? And so you can test your hypothesis, right? So I think that classical music gets people's brain more engaged and it allows them to remember these numbers. Or if it doesn't, you can make an alternate hypothesis or an alternate explanation, right? I think that the music distracted them, and that's why they didn't remember as many. When we talk about experiments, a good experiment has really narrowly defined kind of questions that you're going to answer. There's often a tendency for students to kind of bite off more than they can chew, right? I want to study some big issue. I want to study like your political ideology. Well, like that's kind of really big, like I want to study the impact of wealth on political ideology. Well, that's a big topic. How about something more narrow, right? Like I want to study the impact of wealth on, your opinion about gun control. That's more narrow than like your opinion about everything, right? So the more narrow you can make it, the better it is for your experimental design, because you're not going to get so many confounds, right? Confounds are problems that may arise that make your explanations tricky, right? Or make it harder to explain what's going on. And I'll talk about what some of those are in just a moment. But when we do experiments, the idea is to have both internal validity as well as external validity, right? Internal validity means that your experiment works well logically, like inside of its own self, right? If you, a true experiment probably has the highest internal validity because you're randomly assigning your participants, you're controlling everything. So it's easier to kind of see what the causations are. It's harder with quasi experiments or what we might do in the field, because a lot of other things might be going on. So in a classic experiment, usually you're only doing one thing, right? You're only changing one thing in your experiment. I want to introduce, I have 2 groups of women in this Maya community. I want to do a project where I'm going to, do micro loans of $100 or less to half the women in this community, right? And I want to see what happens. It's an experiment that's been played out in many different times and places in like development industry. One of the problems with that, though, because you're not in like a laboratory and you're not, just kind of using the rocks or animals or something like that, is that oftentimes there's more things going on, right? More than just one treatment can be applied, right? Half of those women could be of different ages, or half of them could have gone to get jobs in the city, or some of them had children and some of them didn't have children during the time you're doing the experiment. Lots of different things could be affecting whether those micro loans are useful or not. The other thing, while we can test internal validity, we also want to be concerned with external validity, right? Your ability to compare and contrast different studies. An experiment should be replicable. And this is true whether it's a true experiment, like I want to be able to test in the lab whether I add two chemicals together. I add a red chemical together with a blue chemical and they make green chemical or something like that. I don't know, or a purple chemical. If I'm in a different lab and put those two chemicals together, I want to see the same results, right? If I don't, that means there's probably either something wrong with my experiment or the experiment that I'm trying to replicate. There's something off. In social science, it's often trickier. How might we have external validity in social science, like cultural anthropology? How might we compare between studies? What do you think, Jose? External validity. How might we compare anthropological experiments across different case studies? So if I wanted to study the same thing, like political, I have this hypothesis that I'm going to test about whether the presence of local indigenous authorities leads to greater land rights for that group. That's a common question for someone like you. What's an example of how you might compare and contrast your study with other studies out there?
See how prominent they have, like how much they have moved forward with their indigenous land rights. For example, I can be like the multi-penitentiary Maya have extremely successful land rights because of their voice and how everybody in the community supports the holidays and the social movement. And then we go to Africa, or we can go to Guinea, or we can go to even Guatemala, for example, it's right there. There's indigenous land rights are not so well supported because the communities are so afraid to say that they're Maya because of colonization, they do not want to be viewed as Maya because Maya would be mistreated. You can go to a whole different, so yeah.
Yeah. And so which do you think would have greater validity? Comparing Maya Belize to Maya in Guatemala with their political movements, or Maya Belize and people in Papua New Guinea? Yeah, because you're holding other things constant, right? You got the culture is the same, the language or the language grouping is the same, the forms of authority and kinship and all that's the same. So the more things we can hold constant, the better. But it is really important to kind of look at these things across the world, because if they don't work, it's an interesting question, right? I see that land rights in Central America, that maybe indigenous leadership is strongly associated with indigenous people getting their land back. But when I look at Africa, maybe it doesn't, right? They might have strong indigenous leadership, but they don't get their land back. Or in Papua New Guinea, there's no strong indigenous leadership, but people have used modern court cases and things like that to get their land back, right? It's the compare and the contrast. We call this, remember, ethnology back in introduction to cultural anthropology, often is really important. And is kind of what we're going for in these things, right? Comparing different case studies gives us the ability to not just say, in my one case of Loch Ness Monster, how much people live in Loch Ness Monster in Portalis versus Scotland. That's interesting, but I can compare across cases, and then I can make a bigger claim that people who live near cryptid sighting locations have a higher belief in cryptids, right? Around the world, whether it's Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot or whoever. Yeah, I think we'll do this and then that'll be it for today. When we talk about doing research, one of the problems is what we call confounds. And confounds are things that just make your research more difficult, or they they make it so your explanations are not quite as clear, right? Or they're things that kind of mess with your research design. And he lists a whole bunch of these. These are, again, it's like a quiz kind of question about what are the different kinds of confounds and what do they mean, right? Um, somebody remind me again, what's the difference between an independent and a dependent variable?
The independent variables can change.
Yeah. And so we want to test, one of the things that can confound that is when another independent variable is kind of introduced into our study. And he gives us especially if we're doing a pre-test and a post-test, something else happens to those groups which change the outcome, right? So, for instance, he had somebody was doing an experiment where half the kids get a penny if they do good at their every time they get an arithmetic problem right, and half of them don't. I'm going to pre-test my groups, then I'm going to give them all a penny for a year every time they get a math problem right, and then I'm not going to give the other group a penny. So sorry. And then at the end, I'm going to test it, right? In an ideal world of experimenting, that might work. But for instance, in the case that he talks about, right in the middle of that year-long educational study, the governor and the educational board changed the standards about what teachers were supposed to be teaching and to put more emphasis on arithmetic, right? So even though you're still running your experiment kind of in the background, the actual social conditions can change, right? If I'm looking at something like health in Maya communities, when I do my pre-test and I say, these people over here, I have this group of Mopan, half of them live in Guatemala, half of them live in Belize. I'm going to do pre-test, I'm going to do post-test, and I'm going to see, what the health interventions are. But maybe there's like a hurricane that comes through and it hits one of the villages, but not the other one, or there's a civil war or something like that, right? There can be lots of other things which are outside of your experiment that can impact what's going on. This is especially true the longer your experiment goes on. So if I'm going to do like a 50-year, they do these like longitudinal studies or panel studies. There's a really famous one in sociology. I think it's called like 7 Up. And they basically follow this group of kids from the time they're 7, and then they check back in with them every 7 years. And there's a documentary that goes along with the study. So they have them at like age 7, age 14, age 21. And now they're like on like 77, I think is what they're on now. And so as people go through their life, certain things can happen to them, right? Like some of these people went off to war. Some of these people lost their jobs. Some of these people had good things happen and bad things happen, right? Some of these people, their town closed down because of the mill closing or whatever, right? So we just have to, especially as experiments go on longer, have to take into account the kind of history that's going on that we can't control. The other thing that another confound he calls the maturation confound is that some people grow older and get more experienced as they move through the research. And this can be, again, the longer it takes, the more this can crop up. A great example of this is I want to study, here's 2 groups of people. I want to study their political views. Or I want to study medical. So let's do political views first, right? If I ask, right, I'm going to ask a group of people, what are your political views? And you're 20 years old, right? And then I'm going to come back. I have this really long longitudinal study, and I'm going to study every 7 years, what your political views. And half of you get some experimental treatment. I give you $1,000 in a month or something like that, and the other half don't. And I find that what's a problem that can happen with that true experiment, or with that quasi experiment, I guess? Why might something else be at work besides just the fact that I'm giving some people money and some people not, when I'm interested in how conservative or liberal you are?
The thing is that the older you get, the more conservative you get.
Yeah, right. in most societies in general, this is kind of one of those human universals. It seems like that the older you are, the more conservative you get, right? So, because you're more invested in the status quo, you have more wealth, you have a house, you have a family, or whatever reason, right? And so it may not be that, it may be difficult to disentangle the effect of you doing your experiment with kind of the natural getting older process. Same with sicknesses or illnesses, right? I want to study illnesses, and I do the same experiment. I give some people, I think people who have more money are going to be healthier, so I'm going to give you more money. But as the experiment kind of goes on, people are going to get more sickly, right? Because you're much healthier at age 20 than you are at age 75 or something like that. Another one, another type of confound, which he talks about. This is on 115, testing confounds and instrumental confounds. Testing is if you ask the same question multiple times to people, people can tend to start changing their answer, right? If you ask people, what did you think of your service at Sodexo today? If you ask them once, you'll probably get a pretty good answer. But if you ask them every day, if they come out of Sodexo, they're probably not just going to be like 7, 7, 7, 7 every day, right? Being asked over and over and over are going to make people kind of think about the question more in a different way, and it's going to maybe make them respond in another way. This is especially true, if we were doing ethnographic studies. If you ask somebody if they believe in ghosts, if you ask somebody every day for a year if they believe in ghosts, your answer might not be actually very good, even though you're asking more times, because the person might get sick of the question. They might be like more, but they also might be more open to it, right? Your answer in the beginning might be more guarded, and then you change it later. So you just have to be, interested, or you have to pay attention to kind of how many times you're going to ask the question and how that's changing your results. Probably the bigger one for us in anthropology is what we call instrumental confounds. And this can be both instrument in terms of like an actual physical device, or it could be researcher, right? So if I'm going to, I don't know, I'm going to study, I'm going to look at something under a microscope in a laboratory, right? And I, start my study with my, I don't know, 2020 model microscope, but halfway through the experiment, I get grant funding to upgrade to the fancy new 2024 version of that microscope that can see twice as much, right? And gives me much clearer detail. I might throw my experiment, right? Even though it's a better tool, I might want to wait until I finish this experiment, and then I'm going to switch over to the same tool, right? Because you're changing something about the experiment beyond what's going on in your variables. The bigger one for us with experimental or instrumental confound is multiple researchers, right? Say, for instance, I studied, my research in Belize on religion and cacao farmers, and I found that, my hypothesis actually turned out right, that Protestants have more cacao production or sales in a year than Catholics or something, right? What might be a problem if I send Jose to Belize as a follow-up study? 10 years down the road after I've done my study, I want to see if it's still true, but I can't go. I got stuff going on now. I got to teach. I got a family. I send Jose, my successor in my steed. What might be the problem with sending somebody else?
They won't trust him.
Right? You might have issues of trust because I was there longer. I built up more trust. That might be one reason. What's another thing that can come up?
Different perceptions.
Different perceptions, right? Especially if I don't like nail down definitions. Like what counts as Protestant versus Catholic, right? Am I counting people who are Catholic only at Christmas and Easter, or am I counting people who go to church every day, right? If we have different definitions, or somebody who was raised Catholic versus somebody who's actively Catholic, right? Or how do we define Protestant, right? Do the Jehovah's Witnesses count as Protestant? Do the Mormons, do the Mennonites? How do we define this, right? And so if you change respondents, or if you change researchers halfway through, that can make a difference as well. Like if we're all doing the same survey, I made the survey about belief in ghosts. I give it to all of you. Say, take it home and ask all your family. You might ask in different kinds of ways, right? You might have different relations with your family. Some of you might take it seriously. Some might just ask as a joke. Some might, I don't know. There might be lots of differences. So when you do this, you want to especially pay attention to, if you someday are running a research program with multiple, researchers, like you have a bunch of research assistants, you always want to make sure you train them on exactly the same methods, right? So if we're going to all do pile sorts in here, I'm going to train you all in the exact same way to reduce the variability between them. We will end on that, and we will jump into starting on 116 next time. So thanks so much for hanging out today, and we'll continue our discussion of confounds, and we'll finish that up, and we'll start talking about different kinds of research design next time. So I'll see you all on Wednesday.